Before we get started, I wanted to let everybody know that I have a new book that is available on Kindle, and it is called Recommended Reading for the True Conservative. 50 pages long, and if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free. Other than that, it's $3.99. So again, that is Recommended Reading for the True Conservative. And now, on with the podcast.
Johnny, sex a funny thing. It's a funny thing, sex. Funny thing, sex, you know. I'll tell you the truth. I look at certain people, I just can't picture them having sex, like my wife. It's a funny thing, sex, a funny thing. Yeah, but you talk to some people, they say they enjoy sex at 65. I say if someone needs it that bad, they should pull off the road.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rules Saturday, May the 9th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch and rules for retrogrades. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Inflation is a way to take people's wealth from them without having to openly raise taxes. Inflation is the most universal tax of all. Thomas Sowell. This is a truism with many centuries of precedent. And while it is indeed universal, it also is highly regressive, which is one of the reasons it's so unforgivable that those who most loudly defend a progressive income tax system advocate policies that create the regressive result of inflation. Inflationary effects in consumer goods hurt lower income people more because the price of those goods represents a higher percentage of their income than those in higher income tiers. This is mathematically undeniable, yet also easily ignored by those who advocate for such policies. Inflation is like that, easy to ignore its impact year by year, but impossible decade by decade.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, rules for retrogrades.
Rule 37. You don't need to be a member of a certain class of people to address an issue related to or stemming from said class of people. I often hear radicals brushing off retrograde arguments solely on the basis that the retrograde making a point is not a member of the class that would be affected by his policy proposal. One often hears when debating affirmative action things like, "What would a white man know about the struggles to overcome discrimination?" When debating abortion, one often hears tropes like, "What interest does a man have in a discussion of women's bodies?" When speaking of redefining marriage to accommodate the perverted lusts of homosexuals, we hear, "What interest does a privileged, straight, cisgendered male have in controlling whom people may love?" The asinine presumption underlying these pointed questions is that one can only know truth from experience, as opposed to reasoning to it a priori. No one, not even the most obtuse radicals, actually believes this, though. If it were the case that only someone in a class directly affected by a law should be able to lend his voice to a public policy debate thereon, then only suicide victims could lobby for or against anti-suicide laws. If it were the case, then only people who had previously jumped off a cliff could warn their friends not to jump off a cliff. The nature of the human intellect is such that we don't need to have experienced the effects of an idea as a precondition for saying that the idea is good or bad. We have the power of deduction, the power of reasoning, that guides us to determine whether something is good or evil before we've experienced it firsthand. If we could only know things experientially, then Adam and Eve would have been justified in eating the forbidden fruit, because prior to eating it, they wouldn't have been able to know whether it was truly good for them or bad for them. Radicals try to control who can say things in an effort to silence the maximum amount of dissenting voices. It redounds to the benefit of radicals to set the ground rules of debate in a way that precludes as many erudite retrograde voices as possible from entering into a policy discussion. Do not ever let a radical tell you that you are the wrong type of person to make a point. To put one's finger on the scale of public discourse is to control its outcome. We cannot abide this. The idea that only members of a certain class can opine about matters particularly affecting that class has been silently incorporated even into conservative praxis. Right-wing news outlets, when staging a discussion of a sensitive issue that is widely seen as being particularly intertwined with a specific group's interests, will predictably trot out a panel composed exclusively of members of the group, so as to avoid the danger of being called racist, sexist, or any other ist that compromises radicals' arsenal of groundless slanders for daring to allow an unartificially constrained group of humans to enter into productive dialogue. When a debate over affirmative action takes place on the news, we can count on all panelists being black. When a debate over government-subsidized contraception takes place, we can count on all panelists being women. When a debate over illegal immigration takes place, the media thinks it's a nifty trick to have all participants be of Mexican heritage. This well-accepted practice is actually a serious injustice. When a person is wronged, he should be the one to advocate on behalf of and vindicate his interests. The fact is, the argument against affirmative action is that it discriminates against whites and Asians in favor of blacks. Hence, any debate panel on affirmative action should take pains to incorporate a white or Asian participant, affording members of the offended class a chance to vindicate their own interests. Any debate panel on feminism should take pains to incorporate men, because it is men's rights and prerogatives that have been appropriated by women in the wake of the feminist movement. In fact, one often hears, even in conservative circles, that it's up to women to rise up and repudiate feminism. No, no, no. Women have done enough. Men need to rise up and repudiate feminism, taking back what's rightfully ours. The answer for disorder isn't more disorder. It is precisely because one does a more thorough job at advancing his own interests instead of those of others that the American legal system is adversarial in nature. Never fall into the trap of allowing radicals to dictate who is the right type of person to address an issue. They invariably come to the wrong conclusion, a conclusion whose sole purpose is to handicap the retrograde movement by silencing as many of our voices as they can. If you are the party aggrieved by a radical policy, do not allow radicals to excise you from the public debate on the issue because you are the wrong color or sex. Insist on vindicating your rights personally or through a representative of your interest group. Do this, and we will forever maim radicals' ability to wield divisive group politics. Do this, and we will have a chance to make our voices heard clearly going forward.
And that was Rules for Retrogrades, Rule 37, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy J. and David R. Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Dr. Berg.
Number one earliest sign of dementia is not memory loss, it's not confusion, and it's not forgetting names. And very few people know what I'm about to share with you right now. People associate dementia with forgetting things, right? The small stuff, like where did I put my keys? Or I don't remember your name. Or you might even have confusion, personality changes, and then eventual cognitive decline. That's the story we've been told. And here's the problem with that. By the time those symptoms show up, that disease is already in your brain for 10 to 15, sometimes 20 years. That's right. It takes decades for dementia to occur in the brain. So I think it's really important to understand what are the earlier signs. When you develop this amyloid plaque in your brain that affects the memory centers, it actually starts somewhere else in other parts of the brain that affect other symptoms. Years before the memory thing starts going downhill. Cambridge researchers track people for up to 9 years before their dementia starts kicking in. So they found problems in the brain way before memory problems started. They did find slower reaction times and problems with problem solving. They even found a slight decrease in grip strength. But here's what's fascinating. The one symptom that stood out more than anything, that showed up the earliest, the one that connects amyloid plaques accumulating in certain parts of the brain, was smell. It affects something called the olfactory system in the brain. If you obstruct in any way the olfactory system, your smell will be affected. This means one of the first symptoms of dementia is not your ability to remember. It's your ability to smell. Impaired smell was one of the highest correlating factors. And here's what I would recommend for you. Go in your kitchen, close your eyes, have someone put different spices in front of your nose with your eyes closed, and see if you can readily identify what those spices are. If you have difficulty with this, you might want to get this checked by your doctor, but realize also there's other things that can cause a loss of smell, especially a lack of zinc, which, by the way, also supports the brain centers that are involved with dementia.
And that was Dr. Berg. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the Mossad.
The pager vibrated in Ahmed's pocket as he stood outside the grocery store in southern Beirut. September 17th, 2024, 3:30 in the afternoon. He pulled the device out, saw the encrypted message notification. The screen read, "You have an important message." Standard protocol required pressing 2 buttons simultaneously to decrypt and read it. Ahmed positioned his thumbs on the buttons, pressed them both at the same time, and in that instant, 3 grams of patent explosive detonated directly against his abdomen. The blast tore through his hands, sent shrapnel into his face, and dropped him to the pavement as blood pooled beneath him. He didn't understand what had just happened. Neither did the thousands of other Hezbollah members whose pagers exploded at that exact same moment across Lebanon and Syria. Within 30 seconds, emergency calls flooded Lebanon's hospitals. Within 3 minutes, Hezbollah's entire command structure realized they were under attack. Within 10 minutes, Hassan Nasrallah, the organization's Secretary General, knew his worst fear had come true. The Israelis hadn't just infiltrated Hezbollah's communications. They'd turned every single pager into a remote detonated bomb. And they'd been planning this for 10 years. 3:30 p.m., and the operation that had taken a decade to plan was finally happening. The chaos was immediate and total. Explosions rippled across Lebanon in waves, southern Beirut, the Bekaa Valley near the Syrian border, small towns like Ali and Nahri and Riyak. The blasts weren't confined to Lebanon either. In Damascus, Syria, Hezbollah operatives felt their pagers vibrate, saw the same encrypted message, pressed the same 2 buttons, and suffered the same devastating injuries. The explosions continued for 30 minutes straight. Every few seconds, somewhere in Lebanon or Syria, another pager detonated. Another Hezbollah member went down screaming. The sound of ambulance sirens became a continuous wail across the country. Witnesses described scenes that seemed impossible. A man standing outside a shop, his trouser pocket suddenly exploding, dropping him to the ground with his legs shredded. A father holding his daughter's hand in a market, his belt-mounted pager detonating and killing the 9-year-old girl standing next to him. An 11-year-old boy in the wrong place at the wrong time when his father's pager went off. People bleeding from their faces, their hands, their waists. The injuries followed a pattern that emergency room doctors recognized immediately. These weren't random explosions. Someone had engineered these devices to detonate in specific ways, targeting specific body parts. The pagers had been designed to explode when held in both hands near the face. Dr. Elias Warak at Mount Lebanon University Hospital saw the first casualties arrive and immediately understood what he was dealing with. Severe facial trauma, eyes destroyed, hands amputated or mangled beyond recognition, shrapnel embedded in skulls and brains. He'd been a trauma surgeon for 20 years and had never seen anything like this. The patients kept coming. Dozens, then hundreds, then over 1,000 in a single afternoon. Every emergency room in Lebanon was overwhelmed within an hour. The Lebanese Ministry of Health issued an urgent directive. Anyone carrying a pager needed to throw it away immediately. Healthcare workers were told to discard their devices. The state-run National News Agency put out an emergency call for blood donations. Ambulance crews from Tripoli and Al-Qalamun, cities hours away in northern Lebanon, were dispatched south to help transport the wounded. 150 hospitals across Lebanon activated emergency protocols. The scenes inside those hospitals were chaotic and desperate. Doctors performed triage in parking lots because emergency rooms were full. Nurses ran between patients, trying to stop bleeding, trying to save eyes, trying to prevent people from dying on gurneys in hallways. And the victims kept arriving. What made the attack so devastating wasn't just the number of explosions. It was the precision of the targeting method. The encrypted message that appeared on each pager wasn't random. It was carefully designed. The message required the user to press 2 buttons simultaneously to decrypt and read it. This wasn't an accident. Pressing 2 buttons at the same time meant the user had to hold the pager with both hands. And because the message appeared as encrypted text, most users instinctively brought the device close to their face to read it once decrypted. Mossad had engineered the detonation sequence to maximize facial and hand injuries. The explosion occurred the moment both buttons were pressed. By that point, the user was holding the device in both hands, positioned near their eyes. The result was catastrophic. Of the more than 2,700 people injured in the first wave of explosions, 300 lost both eyes. Another 500 lost one eye. Hundreds more suffered amputated fingers or entire hands blown off. The shrapnel from the explosions, tiny fragments of the pager's plastic casing and internal components mixed with bone fragments from the user's own hands, became secondary projectiles that tore into faces and embedded in brain tissue. Surgeons worked through the night performing emergency eye removals and hand amputations and cranial surgeries to extract shrapnel from skulls. Among the wounded was Mojtaba Amani, Iran's ambassador to Lebanon. He'd been carrying one of the pagers. When it vibrated and displayed the encrypted message, he followed the same protocol as everyone else. He pressed both buttons. The explosion destroyed one eye completely and severely damaged the other. 2 additional Iranian embassy staffers were also injured in the blasts. Iran's involvement with Hezbollah was no secret, but having their ambassador maimed in the attack sent a clear message. Israel wasn't just targeting Hezbollah fighters. They were targeting anyone connected to the organization's command and communications network. And they'd done it in a way that was simultaneously precise and indiscriminate. Precise, because only people carrying the specific pagers were hit. Indiscriminate, because Israel had detonated thousands of devices simultaneously without any way to verify who was holding each one or where they were when it exploded. The attack came exactly one day after Amos Hochstein, the Biden administration's special envoy to the Middle East, had visited Israel and personally warned Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu against any action that might provoke a major escalation in Lebanon. Berndt, Hochstein had been clear. The United States did not want a wider war. The conflict in Gaza was already devastating. Adding Lebanon to the mix would destabilize the entire region. Netanyahu had apparently listened politely and said nothing. What Hochstein didn't know was that the operation was already in motion. The pagers had already been distributed. The detonation codes had already been prepared. And just minutes before the explosions began, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant called U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and informed him that an operation in Lebanon was about to commence. By the time Austin processed what Gallant had just told him, the first pagers were already exploding in Beirut. But to understand how Israel pulled this off, we need to go back, but years, because Operation Grim Beeper didn't start in 2024. It started a decade earlier in 2015, when Mossad began planting the seeds for what would become the most devastating intelligence breach in Hezbollah's history. The operation required patience, misdirection, and a level of strategic thinking that most intelligence agencies couldn't sustain for more than a year or two. Mossad sustained it for 10 years. They played the long game. They built front companies. They established supply chains. They created entire corporate identities that existed solely to sell explosive-laden communication devices to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah never suspected a thing. The groundwork started in 2015 when Mossad operatives began planting booby-trapped walkie-talkies inside Lebanon. These weren't sophisticated devices. They were basic ICOM ICV-82 VHF radios, a model that had been discontinued in 2014. Mossad modified them to serve a dual purpose. First, the radios actually worked. Hezbollah could use them for communications, and they functioned exactly as expected. But the devices also contained small amounts of explosive material that could be remotely detonated. More importantly, they contained monitoring equipment that allowed Israeli intelligence to listen to Hezbollah's communications in real time. For 9 years, from 2015 to 2024, Mossad used these devices purely for surveillance. They listened. They learned. They mapped Hezbollah's command structure, identified key operatives, and tracked the organization's movements across Lebanon and Syria. The temptation to detonate the devices must have been enormous, but Mossad held back. They understood that detonating too early would alert Hezbollah to the vulnerability. So they waited. They gathered intelligence, and they planned the next phase. That next phase began in 2023 when Mossad introduced a new element to the operation: pagers, specifically the Gold Apollo AR-924 model. These pagers were perfect for Hezbollah's needs. They could operate for months without recharging. They were simple, reliable, and seemingly impossible to hack or track compared to smartphones. Hezbollah had been using cell phones for years, but they knew Israeli intelligence had infiltrated their networks. Phones could be tracked. Phones could be compromised. Phones were a security risk. So when Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's Secretary General, stood before his commanders in February 2024 and ordered everyone to switch from smartphones to pagers, he believed he was solving a critical security problem. He had no idea he was walking directly into a trap that had been set years earlier. Nasrallah's directive was clear and unambiguous: no more smartphones. Every Hezbollah member, from top commanders to low-level operatives, needed to switch to pagers immediately. The organization needed secure communications that Israel couldn't infiltrate. Pagers were the answer. They were old technology, simple technology, and therefore secure technology. Nasrallah's logic was sound. Israeli intelligence agencies had demonstrated their ability to hack smartphones, track locations, and intercept communications. But pagers? Pagers were one-way communication devices. They received messages, but didn't transmit anything. They didn't have GPS. They didn't connect to the internet. They were, in Nasrallah's mind, the perfect solution. Hezbollah's procurement officers immediately began searching for suppliers who could provide thousands of pagers quickly. They needed devices that were reliable, long-lasting, and met specific technical requirements. The search led them to a Taiwanese company called Gold Apollo, a legitimate manufacturer of paging devices that had been in business for years. Gold Apollo's AR-924 model was exactly what Hezbollah needed. The devices could run for months on a single charge. They were rugged and durable, and they were available in bulk quantities. What Hezbollah didn't know was that Gold Apollo wasn't actually manufacturing the pagers they were buying. The devices were coming from a shell company in Budapest called BAC Consulting, and BAC Consulting was a Mossad front operation. The deception was multi-layered and brilliant. Gold Apollo was a real company. They made real pagers. They had a legitimate business history and a verifiable manufacturing operation in Taiwan. But 3 years earlier, in 2021, Gold Apollo had signed a licensing agreement with BAC Consulting that allowed the Budapest-based company to manufacture and sell pagers under the Gold Apollo brand name. This wasn't unusual. Companies licensed their brand names to third-party manufacturers all the time. What made this different was that BAC Consulting existed solely to manufacture explosive-laden pagers for Hezbollah. The company had an office address in Budapest. They had business registration documents. They had a CEO named Cristiana Barsoni Arcidiacono, who gave interviews and signed contracts. But the office was empty. When journalists from Deutsche Welle visited the address listed for BAC Consulting, they found only a sheet of paper on the door with the company name. No one answered the doorbell. No one worked there because BAC Consulting wasn't a real company. It was a Mossad-operated front designed to create separation between Israel and the explosive devices being sold to Hezbollah. Xu Qingquang, the founder of Gold Apollo, later described his interactions with BAC Consulting as strange. The payments from BAC were irregular and came through the Middle East rather than through normal European banking channels. But Gold Apollo was a business, and BAC Consulting was paying for the licensing rights, so Xu didn't ask too many questions. He had no idea his company's name was being used to sell bombs disguised as pagers to a terrorist organization. When the explosions happened and journalists started asking questions, Xu immediately denied that Gold Apollo had manufactured the devices. He was telling the truth. Gold Apollo hadn't made them. BAC Consulting had, or more accurately, Mossad had. The New York Times later reported, citing 12 current and former defense and intelligence officials, that Mossad operated BAC Consulting and had created at least 2 other unnamed shell companies to further obscure the connection between Israel and the explosive pagers. The technical sophistication of the devices themselves was remarkable. Each pager contained 3 grams of PETN, a military-grade explosive that's extremely powerful and extremely stable. 3 grams doesn't sound like much, but when detonated next to human tissue, 3 grams of PETN is more than enough to destroy hands, blind eyes, and send shrapnel through flesh and bone. The explosive was integrated directly into the battery compartment of each pager in a way that made it nearly impossible to detect. Even if someone disassembled the pager and examined the battery, the PETN was camouflaged to look like a normal component of the battery's construction. Israeli officials later confirmed that Hezbollah had in fact disassembled several pagers for security inspections. Some of the devices were even scanned with X-ray machines. But the explosive material was so carefully integrated and so expertly hidden that Hezbollah's security teams never detected it. The PETN wouldn't show up in airport security scans either. The amount was too small and too well disguised. Someone could carry one of these pagers through airport security anywhere in the world, and it would pass inspection without raising any alarms. Mossad's planning included extensive testing to calibrate the explosive charge. They used test dummies to determine exactly how much PTN was needed to injure the person holding the pager without killing bystanders standing nearby. This was a deliberate choice. Mossad wanted to injure Hezbollah operatives, not kill them. Dead operatives become martyrs. Injured operatives become walking reminders of Israel's reach and capability. According to Mossad sources who spoke to journalists after the operation, the goal was to create maximum psychological impact. They wanted Hezbollah members to see their colleagues with missing hands and destroyed eyes and understand the message. Israel can reach you anywhere, anytime, with the press of a button. The injured operatives would serve as permanent, visible warnings to anyone thinking about continuing the fight against Israel. Mossad even claimed there was a strong rumor that Hassan Nasrallah himself personally witnessed some of his operatives being hurt by the exploding pagers, though this has never been confirmed. The sales operation was equally sophisticated. Mossad created fake marketing videos promoting the Gold Apollo AR-9 124 pagers. The videos looked professional and legitimate, highlighting the long battery life, durability, and reliability of the devices. These promotional materials were distributed through channels that would reach Hezbollah's procurement networks, but Mossad didn't want to sell the explosive pagers to just anyone. If random customers bought the devices and they later exploded, the operation would be exposed as indiscriminate terrorism. So, Mossad implemented a pricing strategy to control who bought the pagers. When customers unaffiliated with Hezbollah expressed interest in purchasing the devices, they were quoted extremely high prices that made the purchase unattractive. But when Hezbollah's procurement officers inquired about bulk orders, they were offered very attractive pricing. Hezbollah thought they were getting a good deal on quality communication devices. In reality, they were being steered toward buying bombs. Sky News later reported that Hezbollah ordered 5,000 pagers, but Israel claimed they actually sold Hezbollah over 16,000 walkie-talkies in addition to the pagers. That meant tens of thousands of explosive devices were distributed throughout Hezbollah's ranks over the course of several months in 2024. Hezbollah distributed the pagers throughout their organization based on rank and function. Lower-ranking members and field operatives received the Gold Apollo pagers. Higher-ranking commanders and leadership used different communication methods. This distribution pattern would later prove significant because it meant the pager explosions primarily affected Hezbollah's operational and administrative personnel rather than its top leadership. The pagers were still being distributed right up until the day of the attack. Some Hezbollah members had received their devices only hours before the explosions. This created a situation where even if Israel had wanted to verify who was carrying each pager at the moment of detonation, it would have been impossible. The devices were too new, too recently distributed, and moving through Hezbollah's networks too quickly for any real-time tracking. Turkey's National Intelligence Organization apparently detected part of the operation just days after the initial attacks. Turkish intelligence intercepted a shipment at Istanbul airport containing 1,300 pagers and 700 chargers destined for Lebanon. Experts examined the devices and found explosive and flammable liquids inside them. Whether this was a second wave of Mossad-supplied devices or a separate operation remains unclear, but it demonstrated that the explosive pager concept wasn't limited to the devices that detonated in September. There were more out there, potentially thousands more, and someone, somewhere, had the ability to detonate them remotely. Then came September 17th, 2024. At exactly 3:30 in the afternoon, Beirut time, the detonation signal was sent. Thousands of pagers across Lebanon and Syria received the activation code simultaneously. The devices vibrated. The encrypted message appeared on the screens. Users pressed the two buttons to decrypt and read the message, and the explosions began. The first wave lasted approximately 30 minutes. During that half hour, thousands of Hezbollah members were wounded. At least 12 people died, including 2 children. The Lebanese Health Ministry reported that the vast majority of casualties arriving at emergency rooms were wearing civilian clothing, and their Hezbollah affiliation was unclear. This created immediate confusion about who had been targeted and why. Were these all Hezbollah fighters, or were civilians being hit as well? The answer, it turned out, was both. Hezbollah wasn't just a military organization, it was also a political party with extensive social service networks. Many people carrying the pagers worked in administrative roles, civil service positions, or Hezbollah-affiliated charities. One victim was a hospital orderly at Al-Rasul Al-Azam Hospital, which was linked to a Hezbollah charity. He was carrying a pager for work communications. When it exploded, he died. Was he a legitimate military target? International law said no, but he was carrying a Hezbollah-issued communication device, which is why he received one of the explosive pagers. The facial and eye injuries were the most common and most devastating effect. Doctors reported that patients showed clear signs of something being blown up directly in their faces. The pattern was consistent. The pager would be held in both hands. The user would bring it close to their eyes to read the decrypted message. The explosion would occur at point-blank range. Eyes were destroyed. Facial bones were shattered. Shrapnel was embedded in brain tissue. 300 people lost both eyes. 500 people lost one eye. Think about that number for a moment. 800 people permanently blinded, many of them in a single afternoon. Dr. Warwick and other surgeons performed emergency surgeries throughout the night, trying to save what vision they could, but in most cases the damage was too severe. The explosions had destroyed the eyeballs themselves and damaged the optical nerves beyond repair. These weren't injuries that could be fixed with surgery or treatment. These were permanent disabilities inflicted in an instant. The hand injuries were equally severe. Hundreds of patients arrived with fingers torn off or entire hands amputated by the blast. The explosion occurred while the user was gripping the pager with both hands, which meant both hands absorbed the full force of the detonation. Fingers were blown off at the knuckles. Palms were shredded. Bones were shattered. In many cases, surgeons had no choice but to amputate what remained of the hand because the tissue damage was too extensive to save. These injuries weren't just physically devastating. They were economically and psychologically catastrophic. How does a 30-year-old man support his family when he's lost both hands? How does a young woman live independently when she's been completely blinded? These weren't soldiers who signed up for combat and understood the risks. Many of them were administrators, civil servants, healthcare workers, and charity employees who carried pagers because their employer was affiliated with Hezbollah. 24 hours after the first wave, at 5 p.m. on September 18th, the second wave hit. This time, the targets were ICOM ICV-82 walkie-talkies. These were the devices Mossad had been planting since 2015. For 9 years, they'd been used solely for surveillance. Now it was time to detonate them. The explosions rippled across Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, and southern Lebanon. Fires broke out in at least 71 homes and shops as the walkie-talkies detonated. 15 cars caught fire. Motorcycles exploded. A lithium battery store in Majdel Selm went up in flames when multiple devices detonated inside. The Lebanese civil defense scrambled to respond to fires across the entire Nabatea governorate. And then came the cruelest explosion of all. A funeral was being held in Beirut for 3 Hezbollah members and a child who had been killed in the first wave of pager explosions. Mourners had gathered to pay their respects. Several people at the funeral were carrying walkie-talkies. When those devices detonated, the funeral turned into another mass casualty event. At least 30 people were killed in the second wave. Over 750 were injured. One explosive device was discovered inside an ambulance parked outside the American University of Beirut Medical Center before it could detonate. The Lebanese army performed a controlled explosion to neutralize it. The walkie-talkies were ICOM ICV-82 models, a device that had been discontinued in 2014. ICOM, the manufacturer, had previously issued warnings about counterfeit versions of this radio being sold on the market. After the explosions, ICOM launched an investigation and announced it was highly unlikely the radios that exploded were genuine ICOM products. A sales executive at ICOM's U.S. subsidiary said the devices appeared to be knockoffs. Whether Mossad manufactured counterfeit ICOM radios or modified genuine discontinued units remains unclear. What is clear is that these devices had been sitting inside Hezbollah's communication networks for years, waiting to be activated. And when the activation signal came, they detonated with the same devastating effect as the pagers. Other electronic devices reportedly exploded during the second wave, including fingerprint biometric scanners. Whether these devices were independently rigged with explosives or simply caught fire from nearby explosions remains unknown. But the psychological impact was clear. Hezbollah members couldn't trust any electronic device. Pagers exploded. Walkie-talkies exploded. Maybe phones would explode next. Maybe laptops. Maybe anything with a battery and a circuit board. The paranoia was immediate and total. In the aftermath of the second wave, angry crowds in Tyre attacked United Nations interim force in Lebanon vehicles before Lebanese armed forces intervened. The rage and confusion were overwhelming. Lebanon was under attack, but there were no missiles, no airstrikes, no visible enemy. The weapons were communication devices that people had been carrying in their pockets for months. By September 20th, the final casualty count was staggering. 42 people dead, over 3,500 injured. The injured included elderly people and young children, healthcare workers and civil servants, Iranian diplomats and Hezbollah fighters. Lebanese Foreign Minister Abdallah Bou Habib later confirmed that most of those carrying pagers were not fighters. They were administrators. According to an unnamed Hezbollah official who spoke to Reuters, 1,500 Hezbollah fighters were taken out of action due to injuries.
And that was the Mossad. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.